there is a city in Russia that does not exist. It has streets. It has schools and hospitals and apartment buildings and parks where children play in summer. It has a post office and a cinema and a church and a cemetery where ordinary people are buried under ordinary headstones. But for 45 years, it had no name on any map, no address in any directory, no mention in any newspaper, no acknowledgement from any government official. If you asked the Soviet state about this place, the answer was always the same. There is nothing there. 65,000 people lived in nothing. They were born in nothing, grew up in nothing, fell in love in nothing, raised their children in nothing, and many of them died in nothing without ever once leaving the boundaries of a place that officially did not exist. This is the story of Arzama 16. And once you understand what happened there, you will never think about freedom, secrecy, or the cost of the most dangerous knowledge in human history the same way again. It begins like so many Soviet stories begin, with a knock at the door. November 1946. The war has been over for a year and a half. The great cities of the Soviet Union are still rebuilding. Leningrad is still counting its dead. Moscow is still clearing rubble. The people who survived the most destructive conflict in human history are trying, cautiously, tentatively, to begin believing in the future again. Anatoly Berezin is 31 years old. He is a physicist. He works at a research institute in Moscow, living in a small apartment with his wife, Natasha, and their 2-year-old daughter, Masha. He is not a famous man. He is not a powerful man. He is simply a good scientist who is quietly excellent at his work, which involves the behavior of high-energy particles under extreme conditions. He is also, without knowing it yet, exactly the kind of man that the Soviet state is looking for. The knock comes on a Tuesday morning. Berezin opens the door expecting a neighbor. 2 men in civilian clothes are standing in the hallway. They are polite. They are very polite. One of them shows a document. The other one smiles. They would like Comrade Berezin to come with them. Just for a conversation, they say. Just a brief discussion. Nothing to worry about. Berezin looks back at Natasha, who is standing in the kitchen doorway holding Masha on her hip. Her face is careful and still in the way that Soviet faces learned to be careful and still when men in civilian clothes appeared at doors. She says nothing. He says nothing. He gets his coat. He does not know that this is the last ordinary morning of his life. The men take him to an office in a building he does not recognize. He waits for 3 hours. Then a different man enters the room. This man is in uniform. He sits across the table from Berezin and opens a folder and does not look up for a long time. Then he looks up. He tells Berezin that the Soviet Union is working on a project of supreme national importance, that the country's survival may depend on the success of this project, that Berezin has been identified as someone with the specific skills that this project requires. He is being asked to volunteer. Berezin, who is a physicist and therefore understands things in precise terms, hears the word volunteer and understands immediately that it does not mean what it usually means. He asks what the project is. The man in uniform closes the folder. He says that the nature of the project cannot be discussed until Berezin has agreed to participate. He says that participation will require Berezin to relocate. He says that the location cannot be disclosed. He says that the duration of the assignment is indefinite. He says that Berezin's family can come with him. He says that once Berezin arrives, he will not be permitted to leave. Then he folds his hands on the table and waits. Berezin thinks about Natasha in the kitchen doorway. He thinks about Masha on her hip. He thinks about the folder and the uniform and the 2 men who were so very polite when they knocked on his door on a Tuesday morning. He says yes. What Berezin is agreeing to become part of is the most secret project in Soviet history and one of the most consequential scientific endeavors of the 20th century. The Soviet Union is building an atomic bomb. The Americans had detonated their first nuclear weapon in July 1945. They had dropped two more on Japan in August of that year. The world had changed in a way that could not be undone. The era of atomic weapons had arrived, and every major power on Earth understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, what that meant. The Soviet Union was behind. Joseph Stalin understood that being behind in the atomic race was not merely a military disadvantage. It was an existential threat. The United States had the bomb. The Soviet Union did not. In the brutal arithmetic of post-war geopolitics, that meant the United States could, in theory, end the Soviet Union without the Soviet Union being able to respond in kind. This was unacceptable. Stalin assigned the task to Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the secret police, a man of terrifying competence and casual brutality who approached scientific problems with the same methods he used for political ones. You find the right people, Beria understood. You put them in a controlled environment. You remove all obstacles. You apply sufficient pressure, and you get results. The project was given a name, the Special Design Bureau, KB-11, and it needed a location, somewhere remote enough to be secure, somewhere that could be completely isolated, somewhere that would not appear on any map or in any record. They chose a place in the Nizhny Novgorod region, about 400 kilometers east of Moscow. It was near a small monastery town called Sarov. The monastery itself was centuries old, a place of Orthodox pilgrimage, sacred ground in the traditional sense. None of that mattered. The monastery was cleared. The monks were removed. The town of Sarov was erased from Soviet maps. And in its place, the secret city began to be built. It would be known by many names over the years. KB-11, Arzamas 16, the installation, the object. The residents would eventually simply call it the city, but its most precise name, the name that captured its essential nature most completely, was the one that appeared in no official document. The place that did not exist. Construction began in 1946, conducted under conditions of total secrecy by workers who themselves did not fully understand what they were building. The perimeter came first. 3 concentric fences, each more formidable than the last. The outer fence was a simple wire barrier, the kind you might see around any Soviet industrial facility. The middle fence was electrified. The inner fence was topped with barbed wire and monitored by guards with dogs and orders to shoot. Between these fences and beyond them, on both sides, was a restricted zone. No one entered without the correct documents. No one left without the correct documents and the correct authorization. The guards were not border army troops or interior ministry units. They were a specially selected security force that answered directly to the project leadership and above them to Beria himself. Watchtowers were placed at regular intervals along the perimeter. Searchlights swept the ground at night. The city was surrounded by forest, and the roads leading to it were unmarked and in many places deliberately misleading. If you somehow found yourself driving toward Arzamas 16 without authorization, you would encounter checkpoints long before you reached the fences. You would be stopped, questioned, and if your documents were not in order, you would be arrested. Nobody wandered into Arzamas 16 by accident. Inside the perimeter, the city was built to a standard that was, by Soviet norms of the time, extraordinarily comfortable. This was not an accident and it was not generosity. Beria and the project leadership understood something that purely coercive systems often fail to grasp, that the people they needed could not be simply forced to do brilliant scientific work. Hunger and misery produce confession. They do not produce quantum physics. So the scientists and engineers of Arzamas 16 were given apartments that were large by Soviet standards. They were given good food, at a time when ordinary Soviet citizens were still recovering from wartime shortages. They were given access to books and music and films. Their children had good schools. Their hospitals were better equipped than most facilities in the country. There was a library that received foreign scientific journals, which almost nowhere else in the Soviet Union could say. The city was a gilded cage, and like all gilded cages, it was designed to make you forget, if possible, that the door was locked. Anatoly Berezin arrived in early 1947 with Natasha and Masha. He was met at a checkpoint by a security officer who reviewed his documents, issued him an internal identification card, and explained the basic rules. The rules were not complicated. He could move freely within the city limits. He could speak to his colleagues about their work. He could attend lectures and use the library. He could take walks in the designated areas of the surrounding forest when accompanied by approved personnel. He could not write letters without submitting them for review. He could not receive uncensored letters. He could not make telephone calls to the outside without authorization. He could not tell anyone outside the facility where he lived or what he worked on. He could not describe the city, its layout, its population, or any detail of its existence to anyone who did not already know about it. He could not leave. The last rule was stated simply, without drama or elaboration. Departure from the facility required written authorization from the project leadership. Such authorization was granted for specific purposes: a family medical emergency outside the facility, a mandatory external consultation, occasionally a carefully monitored visit to Moscow for professional reasons. Each departure was documented, timed, and supervised. No one simply went home for the weekend. No one took a spontaneous trip to see relatives. No one drove to the nearest town for a change of scenery. The nearest town with any kind of unrestricted access was many kilometers away, on the other side of multiple checkpoints, and getting there without authorization was not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was a crime. Berezin put his family's belongings in their new apartment, which was on the third floor of a solid brick building on a quiet street. The apartment had 2 bedrooms. It had hot water, which was not guaranteed in much of the Soviet Union at that time. It had a view of a small park where other scientists walked with their families in the evenings. He stood at the window and looked out at the park and the street and the apartment buildings beyond it, and somewhere past all of that, invisible from here but entirely real, the fences. Natasha came and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything. What was there to say? They were here. This was their life now. Somewhere in this city, in a facility he had not yet seen, was the work he had been brought here to do. Somewhere beyond those fences was the world they had come from, which they could see in their minds but could not reach. Masha was in the other room, already asleep, already at home in the way that 2-year-olds are at home anywhere they are placed, in the uncomplicated way of people too young to understand what has been given up on their behalf. Berezin put his hand on Natasha's shoulder. She put her hand over his. That was all. The scientific work began almost immediately. KB-11 had been assigned the most challenging technical problem of the age: build a nuclear weapon. The Americans had done it. The British were working on it. The Soviets had some intelligence about the American program, gathered at great cost and risk by agents who had penetrated the Manhattan Project. But intelligence about what had been done was not the same as the knowledge of how to do it, and the Soviet scientists understood that they could not simply copy what the Americans had built without deeply understanding the underlying physics. Igor Kurchatov was the scientific director of the Soviet atomic program. He was a brilliant man, a powerful personality, someone who understood both the physics and the politics with equal precision. He visited Arzamas 16 regularly in the early years, pushing the work forward, adjudicating disputes between researchers, managing the constant pressure from Beria and from Stalin himself. The pressure from above was immense and unceasing. Stalin had been told, by advisors who may have been optimistic or may have been afraid to tell him otherwise, that the bomb could be ready in 3 years. 3 years from 1946 meant 1949. That was the deadline. Not a soft deadline, not a target, not a goal. A deadline in the Soviet sense, which meant that failure to meet it would have consequences of the kind that physicists feared more than scientific failure. Beria made this clear in his periodic visits to the facility. He was a compact, soft-spoken man who wore round spectacles and spoke quietly. His quiet manner was, everyone understood, precisely the most frightening thing about him. Loud men threaten. Quiet men who control the secret police deliver. He would tour the laboratories, ask questions, listen to the answers with patient attention, and then say something like, "We are confident in your ability to succeed." And everyone in the room would understand that this confidence was not a comfort. It was a warning. The scientists worked. They worked with the focused intensity of people who understood that the fate of their country, and, in a more private sense, their own fates, depended on their success. They worked 7 days a week in the early years. They worked through nights when problems refused to yield. They argued in their offices and in the corridors, and in each other's apartments about approaches and calculations and theoretical models. The way scientists argue, which is to say loudly and precisely, and with complete disregard for anything except the truth of the matter. Berezin worked on implosion dynamics. This was one of the central technical challenges of the bomb design. A nuclear weapon of the type they were building required a conventional explosive charge to be detonated in a perfectly symmetrical pattern around a core of fissile material, compressing that core to the density at which a chain reaction becomes self-sustaining. The symmetry had to be nearly perfect. Even a small asymmetry in the detonation would cause the core to deform before it reached critical density, and the weapon would fail. Getting the symmetry right required a precise understanding of how shock waves propagated through different materials and how they interacted at boundaries. It required, in other words, exactly the kind of expertise that Berezin had. He threw himself into the work. Not because he had no choice, though in some sense he had no choice. He threw himself in because the work was genuinely extraordinary. He was working on problems that had never been solved before, in collaboration with some of the most brilliant minds in Soviet science, with resources that were, by any measure, extraordinary. Whatever else could be said about his situation, the intellectual environment was remarkable. And the work mattered, in a way that almost no work in the history of science had ever mattered before. They were not building a better engine or a faster aircraft or a more effective medicine. They were working on the mechanism that would determine whether the Soviet Union survived in a world where the alternative was to face American nuclear monopoly without a deterrent of its own. He knew this. All of them knew this. It was a weight and a motivation simultaneously, pressing down and pushing forward at the same time. While the scientists worked, the city grew. More physicists arrived, more engineers, mathematicians, chemists, specialists in metallurgy and explosives and electronics, and a dozen other fields that a nuclear weapons program required. Each of them came in the same way Berezin had come, taken aside, told the minimum necessary to obtain consent, transported to a location they could not disclose, and settled into a life defined by the space between two invisible walls, one physical and one psychological. The physical wall was the fence. The psychological wall was everything they had agreed to carry in silence. Families came with the scientists, wives and husbands and children who were told even less than the scientists themselves. The wives of the physicists knew, in general terms, that their husbands were working on something important and secret for the state. They knew they were not allowed to discuss where they lived. They knew their mail was read. They knew they could not visit their parents without a bureaucratic process that might take months and might be denied. What they did with this knowledge varied. Some of them adapted with remarkable equanimity, building lives within the available space with the pragmatic resilience that Soviet experience had bred into people over decades. Some of them struggled quietly, carrying a loneliness that had no name and could be shared with no one outside. Some of them thrived, finding in the city's community of brilliant, intense, driven people, a kind of social richness that compensated for its geographical constriction. The children knew almost nothing. They grew up in the city as children grow up anywhere, absorbing their world as normal because it was the only world they knew. They went to the same schools as the children of guards and workers. They played in the same parks. They did not know what their parents did exactly, except that it was important. They did not know that their city had no name on any map. They did not know that the world outside the fence was a thing that other children took for granted. Some of them would grow up to be scientists themselves, following their parents into the work that had brought the city into existence. Some would leave when leaving became possible, years or decades later, carrying the city inside them like a country they had been exiled from by the act of being allowed to go. But that was all far in the future. In the early years of KB-11, in the late 1940s, the future was not a thing that occupied the mind very much. The present was too intense and too pressing for the future to get much attention. The deadline was real, the pressure was real, the fences were real. And somewhere at the center of all of it, the work was real. Berezin found a rhythm. He was at the laboratory before 8 in the morning. He worked until at least 8 in the evening. He came home to Natasha and Masha, ate dinner, sometimes sat for an hour with a book or listened to music on the radio. He slept. He rose before 7. He walked to the laboratory. On Sundays, which were technically not working days though few people actually did not work, he and Natasha took Masha to the park. The park was small but well maintained, with benches and a sandbox and a path that circled under old pine trees. Other scientists walked there with their families. Children ran on the grass. It looked, if you did not think too hard about the context, like any Sunday in any reasonably prosperous Soviet city. Berezin sometimes found himself, on these Sunday mornings, achieving a kind of peace that surprised him. The work was good. His family was safe and well-fed in a country where neither of those things was guaranteed. Masha was growing into a quick, curious child who asked questions about everything with a persistence that he recognized in himself. He loved his wife with the uncomplicated depth of a man who understood how lucky he was. He had colleagues he genuinely liked and admired. He had problems worthy of his mind. He was, in the ways that most immediately mattered, content. And then he would look up from the Sunday park and see, through the trees at the edge of the designated walk, the wire of the inner fence catching the morning light. And the contentment would develop a shadow, a slight dimming, like a cloud passing briefly over the sun. He was content. He was also a prisoner. Both of these things were true. He had learned to hold both of them at the same time, the way you learn to carry something awkward, adjusting constantly to keep it balanced. Most days the balance held. On some days it did not. On the days when the balance did not hold, Berezin thought about his parents in Moscow. His father was getting older. His mother had written a letter, carefully worded, that passed the censors without any of the things she most wanted to say, that his father's health was not good. He had written back, carefully worded in the same way, that he was well and that he thought of them often. What he could not write was where he was. What he could not write was that he could not come. What he could not write was that, by the time he received permission to visit, if he ever received permission, things might have changed in ways that permission could not fix. His father died in 1949. The letter from his mother arrived 3 weeks after the fact, delayed by the censorship process. He read it in his office, sitting at the desk surrounded by calculations for the implosion dynamics problem that he had been working on for 2 years. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the desk drawer. He sat for a long time. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to work. He could not go to Moscow to see his mother. He could not attend his father's funeral. He could not grieve openly in a way that acknowledged what had been lost, because acknowledging it fully would have required also acknowledging why he could not go, and that acknowledgement had a shape that the balance he had carefully constructed could not hold. He went back to work. This is the sentence that appears most often, in different forms, in the accounts of people who lived in Arzama's 16 during the secret years. Faced with grief or longing or frustration, or the particular hollow ache of a life lived behind a fence, they went back to work. It was not avoidance exactly. It was not the absence of feeling. It was something more complex and more human. It was the decision, made again and again, to invest the available self in the thing that was available. The work was available. The work was real. The work mattered in ways that were concrete and measurable. And in the absence of freedom, the work was something that belonged entirely to them, in the way that the exercise of genuine skill always belongs to the person exercising it, regardless of the context in which it is exercised. The work kept them sane. The work kept them whole. The work was, in a very real sense, the only form of freedom available inside a place that had no freedom. And the work, in August 1949, produced a result.